Hi, I'm Gareth Green, and in this video we're going to be thinking about how to compose using borrowed chords from the parallel key. So first of all, we better just get our terms of reference sorted out. What do we mean by parallel key as opposed to relative key? Because they're actually two different things. So if I'm in the key of C major, I can talk about A minor being the relative minor of C major, and it's the relative minor because it shares the same key signature. C major has no sharps or flats in the key signature. A minor has no sharps or flats in the key signature. There are things we do when we play a scale of A minor, raising the 7th note or raising the 6th and the 7th note, depending on which kind of minor we're using or whether we're using natural minor perhaps. But that is a relative minor key. So you always have a relative minor key that's a minor third below its relative major key. So that's one thing that people might already know quite a lot about. The parallel key is, in a way, a very simple thing to define. If I'm in C major, the parallel key is C minor. So you simply stick with the same letter name and you say, okay, if I'm in a major key, what's the minor key that starts in the same place, has the same tonic, the same first note? Or the other way around, if I'm in A minor, the parallel key is A major. If I'm in D major, the parallel key is D minor. So what we're talking about here is not relative minor keys, but we're talking about parallel keys. So for the example that we're going to look at, we're going to work in the key of G major. So the relative minor is E minor. That's not what we're talking about here, but the parallel minor is G minor. So what are we talking about then if we're talking about borrowing chords? Well, we're basically saying if I'm in the key of G major, and just to add to the colour of what's going on in the chord life of the piece, I want to borrow a chord from G minor, then that's okay. I can have a piece of music that's in G major, but every now and again just borrow a chord from G minor. Well, how do I do that? If I'm going to borrow a chord, let's start on the basis that when we're talking about minor keys, we're talking about the harmonic minor for now. Why do I say that? Well, the clue's in the title. If it's called the harmonic minor, then it's the minor scale that we often use for harmony. You may well use a different kind of minor scale, or you might always write in the natural minor or something, that's fine. But the convention going back from 1600 onwards is that we fundamentally use the harmonic minor scale to write harmony, to write our chords. So what we're looking at then is, well, which are the chords that we might have in G major and how do they compare with the same chord in G minor? So if I'm in G major, here's my scale, G, A, B, C, D, E, F sharp, G. If I want to form all my chords in G major, I have what we call a root, a third, and a fifth for every note of that scale. So what we call chord 1, the tonic chord, is G, the first note of the scale, with the third note and the fifth note above it. And anything that's in the key signature we're going to use in the chord. So G major's got an F sharp in the scale, F sharp. So anytime F comes up in a chord, it will be F sharp, and we'll see how that shapes up. So in G major, chord 1, G, B, D, that's my first chord. Chord 2, otherwise known as the supertonic chord, is A, second note of the scale, with its third and its fifth. So A, C, E is chord 2, the supertonic chord. Chord 3, or the median chord, is B, D, F sharp. Remember, F sharp's in the scale, so I'm not going to use F natural, I'm going to use F sharp. So chord 3, or the median chord, B, D, F sharp. Chord 4 is the subdominant chord, and that's C, E, G. Chord 5 is the dominant chord, and that's D, F sharp, A. That's our chord 5. Chord 6, or the submediant chord, is E, G, B. So that's my chord 6. And the chord 7 is the leading note chord, and it's F sharp, A, C. Okay, so that's the chord 7. And then we don't have a chord 8 because chord 8's the same as chord 1. It's got the same notes in it. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and back to 1 again. So those are the chords that we have in G major. Now let's think about G harmonic minor for a moment, and then we can compare that with the chords for G major. Okay, so in G harmonic minor, we have 2 flats in the key signature. So B flat and E flat are in the key signature, and in the harmonic minor scale we always raise the 7th note. So the 7th note is F, it becomes F sharp. So if I've got to have a scale of G minor that's got B flat, E flat, and then we're adding an F sharp to it, that's how the harmonic minor scale goes for G minor. So again, we've got to adopt the B flat, the E flat, and the F sharp when we come to the chord life. So chord 1 in G minor is actually G, B flat, D. So you can see how this compares with the parallel key G major, because in G major we said chord 1 is G, B, D, but chord 1 in G minor is G, B flat, D. So you see how it changes the colour of the chord. In G major, chord 1 is a major chord. In G minor, chord 1 is a minor chord. Okay, chord 2 in G minor is A, C, E flat. It's a diminished chord. Whereas actually in G major it's A, C, E natural, and that's a minor chord. So a minor chord in G major, but diminished in G minor. So you see how sometimes one note changes. Okay, when we come to chord 3, we said in G major we had B, D, F sharp. When we're in G minor, we need to use B flat, D, F sharp. So that's a very different sound actually, isn't it? So you see there in G major with B, D, F sharp, we have a minor chord. In G minor with B flat, D, F sharp, we've got an augmented chord. Okay, so chord 4 in G major we said was C, E, G, but in G minor it's going to be C, E flat, G. So what was a major chord in G major is a minor chord in G minor. You see how this is all going. Chord 5 is an interesting one because we've got D, F sharp, A, and that is the same chord for both G major and for G minor. So it's always interesting that the dominant chord, or chord 5, is the same for the parallel major as it is for the parallel minor. And that's quite useful because sometimes you can be using chord 5 in the major or the minor key, and then you can kind of switch when you go to the next chord. So it's quite a useful chord. Okay, now chord 6 in G major we said was E, G, B. Okay, and that was a minor chord. When we put that chord in G minor, we end up with E flat, G, B flat. So we've changed 2 notes there, haven't we? And it becomes a major chord. So we see what the difference is there. And then when we get to chord 7, well, again, that's an interesting one because it's the same in G major as it is in G minor again. So there's your chord 7. So it's interesting that 5 and 7 are the same in the parallel keys. So you'll find that is obviously going to be true for any parallel major, parallel minor relationship. Okay, now then, when we come to writing a piece of music, I mean, I've just sketched out something here that's essentially in the key of G major. You could do the whole thing in G major, no trouble at all. It would sound absolutely fine. But then you might look at it again and think, I could just do with kind of sprucing it up a bit, you know, giving it a little bit more colour. And one way of doing that is to borrow chords from the parallel key. So what you can do is what I've just done. You go through, work out all your chords for G major. You then work out all your chords for G minor. In this case, we're using G harmonic minor. And then you think, okay, what's the difference between the major and the minor? And is there anywhere that I might be able to borrow a chord? Now, technically, you could borrow any chord, but really, as is always the case with music, works firstly with sound. You know, people are quite often making comments on videos saying things like, oh, it's all about theory and what's that got to do with music, and if it sounds good, use it. You know what? I agree with that. It's all about sound. So if it works well, use it. Theory is incredibly helpful because it helps us to understand possibilities like the one we're looking at now. But at the end of the day, borrow a chord. If it sounds rubbish, scrap it. If you borrow a chord and it sounds good, use it. Absolutely. So we're going to sort of see how I've managed to borrow some chords in this extract that I've written, and we can see how they work. And it's hugely about voice leading and about harmonic function. So how does one chord resolve onto the next chord? When you listen to each of the parts that's going, does that sound sensible, or is there some kind of awkwardness getting from one chord to the next? That's where your ears really come into it. Okay, so here's the bit of music that we've got on the screen. This is what it sounds like, and then we'll unpack it. Okay, now the chords in black are the chords in G major. The chords in red are borrowed chords. So let's have a look at, well, what is actually going on in the chord life of this piece. And it doesn't matter about the musical style. This is a kind of style that I've often worked in. You might be working in a different style. It doesn't matter at all. You could do something equally effective using these borrowed chords in just about any style. Well, what am I doing in the first bar of this, or the first measure of this piece? I'm using chord 1 in G major. If you look at these notes, it's all G, B, D. It's all this chord 1 stuff. And I've got a couple of passing notes, and then I'm coming back to the notes of chord 1. So the first bar, the first measure, is all about chord 1. In the second bar, I've used a chord 4, and I happen to be using it in the second inversion. So I'm using chord 4, C, E, G, but G is in the bass, so it's in its second inversion. Okay, now what have I then done? I've gone on to use an E flat. So can you see in that tenor part here, we've had an E natural there, and then I've changed it to E flat. So what am I doing? Here was chord 4 in G major, C, E, G, and now I've used C, E flat, G, which is chord 4 in G minor. So I don't need to use it. I could just carry on in G major. So say I decided to just forget this borrowed chord thing and not use that E flat. I just play it as another G major chord. It would sound fine. Everybody would be quite happy listening to that. But by using this borrowed chord, you can hear how this E flat adds a little bit of colour. And now E flat, hear that E flat, just gives us a bit of colour, doesn't it? So when you kind of listen to the tenor part, you know, this part here, you can hear that it sort of sounds okay as a line in itself. Because this move here is all going by step, isn't it? It's a little chromatic corner going with half steps or semitones. Do you see how that works? So what we call the voice leading works quite nicely, starting on this E, going down a semitone or a half step to E flat, then moving on another half step or a semitone to D, makes that particular line, that tenor line, flow quite nicely. And then we have the added advantage of just hearing the colour of a chord that belongs to the parallel minor. So G major from the beginning, chord 4 in G major, chord 4 in G minor. And you can hear how it just adds a tinge of sadness, if you like. I don't really subscribe to this idea that major keys are happy, minor keys are sad. I think it's too simplistic. But actually, if you just want to do something a little bit sentimental or add a little tinge of sadness, Well, this kind of borrowed 4 thing works quite nicely. And using a 4 followed by a borrowed 4 followed by chord 1 in the original key is actually quite a strong progression, which is what we're doing here. We've got chord 1 in G major, we've got chord 4 in second inversion, we've borrowed 4 still in second inversion, we've gone back to chord 1 in G major. So we've not gone to G minor, we've just lifted that 1 chord in G minor, then we've carried on in G major as if nothing has happened. And then in the third bar, the third measure, going from this point, we've got chord 1 again, I've hopped up into the first inversion and back again. And then essentially in this bar, we've got chord 5, the dominant chord, and then I've just got a little bit of decoration in the alto part here, because I could have just gone straight for a chord 5, would have been a little bit boring, so I've just spruced it up with what we call a suspension in the alto part, and it's a decorated suspension. So don't worry too much about suspensions for now. If you know what they are, that's great. If you don't know what they are, we've got videos out there on suspensions. So that's another topic, but it's another way of kind of sprucing up a piece of music. So when you now listen to this first phrase, the first 4 bars, the first 4 measures, see if you can hear how borrowing this chord 4 from the parallel minor just adds that little bit of colour. Okay, now in the second phrase, I've tried to kind of ramp up the borrowing a bit, because how much can you borrow? In the first phrase, I've just borrowed that 1 chord. It just gives me that little subtle touch of colour at one point. Well, obviously I'm trying to illustrate borrowed chords, so perhaps there's a danger of using too many of them in a short piece of music. But how many can you use? Well, how long is a piece of string? If you use too many, well, you end up confusing the listener, because then we think, are we in a major key? Are we in a minor key? Lord knows. But actually, if you can kind of get them to blend in, that's good. And a lot of it is about this voice leading thing, you know. Are we kind of moving nicely by step when we go across these little, what we call chromatic alterations, you know, that idea of using an E flat instead of an E natural. Because we're going by step, that kind of smooths it out. If it sounds good to go from this chord to that chord, which it does in this case, that is a smoothing of the harmonic function. By using this chord 4 in G major followed by this chord 4 in G minor, both in second inversion, you see how I'm trying to smooth it out by using the same note there, the same note there, the same note here, with this note just moved down by a semitone or a half step. So I'm carrying on with that kind of principle. In the second half, you can see that this is a borrowed chord, and it's a borrowed chord 1 or a borrowed tonic chord. So I'm starting this second line, this second phrase, with chord 1 in G major, and then I'm immediately going to chord 1 in G minor. So you can hear what I'm doing there. There's chord 1 in G major. Here's chord 1 in G minor. And you suddenly hear that kind of darkening of the colour, this slightly brighter, more optimistic sound of the G major chord, and then that slightly darker minor chord. But one thing that helps that is, again, if you notice, this soprano line at the top is going by step. B natural, down a semitone or a half step to B flat, down a semitone or a half step to A. Also notice this note is in common. I'm not moving that G in the bass. I'm not moving this D in the tenor, that's in common. I'm not moving that G in the alto, that's in common. And this is the same note, but we just have a change of accidental. You don't have to do that, but anything that smooths the transition across a borrowed chord is going to make the borrowed chord something more subtle. You know, if you suddenly leap somewhere and throw in a borrowed chord from Lord knows where, and you sort of think, oh, it sounds a bit strange how we've gone from the chord before to that, or sounds strange how we've gone from the borrowed chord to the next chord, well, it's going to stick out like a sore thumb. That may be a particular effect you want, but if you want it to kind of tone in, which is what I'm trying to achieve here, then this kind of part writing, smoothness of part writing kind of matters quite a lot. But hopefully you can now hear that we've got a progression here that works. We've got chord 1 in G major, we've borrowed chord 1 in G minor, and we've gone on to chord 5. Now, one reason why that chord 5 works especially well there, you might remember we said that chord 5 is the same whether you're in G major or in G minor. So if you go from 1 in G major to this chord, it's going to sound fine. If you go 1 in G minor to this chord, it's going to sound fine, because that chord 5, that D major chord, is the same for G major and for G minor. So this is using chord 1, borrowing chord 1 from the parallel minor, going on to chord 5, and it makes for a nice smooth progression. Now, what am I doing when I get to this point? Well, we're using that chord 5. I've just added a note into the tenor part to make that into a dominant 7th, a 5/7. And then I might be expecting to use chord 6 in G major. That will be E natural, B natural, E natural, G natural. But what I've done here is to borrow chord 6 from G minor. So instead of E, B, E, G, I've now got E flat, B flat, E flat, G. So do you see how that sounds if we think about what's happening in this bar? I've got that chord 5, I've added that 7th, and then I've gone on to a borrowed 6. So there's a kind of slight surprise element about that. We might be expecting this, which is what it would be in G major. Now by borrowing, we've got this. So if you like, that's a borrowed chord that's injecting a little bit more of a surprise, partly because we're actually changing 2 notes of the chord. You notice back here, we only changed 1 note. Down here, we only change 1 note. Here, we're changing both E to E flat and B to B flat. But all the other things I've said are still fundamentally true, except this time we're a bit short on common notes. You know, it was easy to repeat notes when we were kind of doing this movement from 1 chord in a major key to the same chord in a minor key. This time what we're doing is we're moving from 1 chord to a different chord, and we haven't got notes in common between that chord 5 in G major and this chord 6 in G minor. So in order to smooth things out, we try to have as much stepwise movement as possible. So notice what I'm doing. The soprano part just goes down by a step. This alto part just goes down by a step. This tenor part continues by a step. This bass part comes up by a step. Okay, now some people might be a little bit worried by this in the alto part, F sharp going to E flat. That's a melodic augmented second. Well, that's a rule, if you like, we should be a bit careful about. But in the case of using a borrowed chord like this, well, it's difficult to avoid, and it's perfectly reasonable to use it. You could fix it by having a shared note, you know, if the alto just went up there and we didn't have this note at all. But in a sense, that weakens the chord. But you could do that just to go on to this, if you're sensitive about that. But if you're not too sensitive, actually it fills out the chord quite nicely. But that's a slightly more shocking, if that's an appropriate word, use of a borrowed chord. You can see the difference between this. These were alterations of the previous chord that just involved changing 1 note and keeping the other notes in common. We're moving from 1 chord to a different chord, but when we move to the different chord, we're borrowing it. We haven't got any notes in common. And when we do borrow this chord from G minor, we find we've got to change 2 notes not just the one. So a number of things are, if you like, more shocking. But you see how we've mitigated it with that stepwise movement. The other thing I'm trying to show here as well is that it's possible to have one borrowed chord followed by another borrowed chord. So you don't just have to have one and then get back to the major key. In this case, I'm borrowing 6 and immediately borrowing 4. So let's just sort of have a listen to this corner. So here's the chord 5 in G major and in G minor, the 7th, the borrowed chord 6 followed by the borrowed chord 4. And then even this passing note is borrowed from the minor that I've put in the tenor, that B flat, just to show that you can clump these together if you want to. Now, why am I going from 6 to 4 in the borrowed situation? Because the advantage of going from 6 to 4, if that's 6 in the minor, this is 4 in the minor, 2 notes are in common. E flat and G are the root and the 3rd of the chord 6. E flat and G are also the 3rd and the 5th of the chord 4. It gives us common notes. So you see, I'm repeating the G in the soprano part. I'm repeating the E flat in the alto part. The tenor part, I'm trying to keep moving by step. The bass part has a little leap to go from the root of 6 to the root of 4. But because we've got enough stability with these common notes up here, that smooths our progression rather than having everybody jumping across the landscape. So we've got from the beginning of this bar, chord 5, adding a 7th, borrowing 6, using the common notes to give us a smooth transition to a borrowed 4, having a passing note that belongs to the borrowed minor, then going back to chord 5, the dominant chord, which remember is the one that's the same for the parallel major and the parallel minor, and then I finish using chord 1 in G major. So you see how we then make a return to G major. Perfectly possible that you could do the whole of that without having any borrowed chords. So if I play the whole thing, but sticking with G major, not using any of those borrowed red chords, it would sound like this. And hopefully you think it sounds all right. Okay. Let's put the borrowed chords in. Do you think it makes a bit of a colour difference? Well, it does make a difference to the colour. It depends what you're trying to convey in terms of mood and style, doesn't it? You may think, well, actually, I prefer just to stay in G major and keep it kind of nice and solid and clean in G major. Fine, great, go for it. But if you're thinking, actually, one of my frustrations is that I'm, quite happily writing something in a key, but I'm just looking for opportunities for colour. I mean, there are many other things you can do. We talked about using suspensions here. You can use these things called chromatic chords, like augmented 6th, Neapolitan chords, diminished 7th chords, all these kind of things. There are other things you can do to change chords. But what we've focused on in this video is how to borrow chords from the parallel key. And I think that's a little technique that many people will find helpful. Well, if you've enjoyed this video, you might like to go to our website, www.mmcourses.co.uk. Lots of things on offer there, so have a little look around and see what you can discover. One of the things on offer there is an opportunity to join our international community called Maestros. There are 3 levels of Maestros and they each come with perks. So you can join at a kind of level 1 and enjoy emojis and all sorts of exciting things. And then you could decide that you wanted to get involved a bit more and join at level 2. So extra perks at level 2, including access to a monthly live stream. So we meet every month. I make an hour of teaching content. We have a live chat running. People get to know each other, get to ask their questions about anything they like. The topics that we cover are often topics that have been requested by members, so try to respond to that. So that's a great community. Then we have our level 3 group. If you're a level 2 member, you get all the benefits of being a level 1 member as well. If you're a level 3 member, then you get the level 3 benefits and the level 2 and the level 1 benefits. The level 3 gives you discounts on our courses and gives you access to an extra live stream each month. And in that live stream, we showcase the work of members if they want to submit it. Some people just like to observe all this. Other people are very actively involved in submitting their compositions, arrangements, harmony exercises, recordings of their performances, anything that you'd really value one-to-one feedback on. And that's what we focus on in the level 3 group. And again, very supportive people from all over the world. It's a great chance to meet others who may be in the same boat that you are. So lots of people are finding that incredibly beneficial. While you're on the website homepage, click on courses as well. Lots of courses that would follow on from the content of this video today, whether it's the advanced theory work, counterpoint, oral dictation, analysis courses, all sorts of things that are there to empower the all-round musician. So have a look at what's there and see what you might enjoy being a part of.